here on the bottom, and on the top is a J. And of course the J stands for being a Jew. And this had to be folded in three. You had to have on your person at all times that whenever the Nazis would ask for it.
It was 1938, and in Amsterdam, a city known for its vibrant life and freedom, an invisible cloud had begun to settle. The colors still sparkled in the canals, and laughter still echoed through the narrow streets. But an undertone of tension filled the air, something so subtle yet undeniable. People went about their routines, yes, but there was a new hesitance, a sense that something ominous lurked just out of sight. Amsterdam had always been a city of refuge, especially for the Jewish community. People felt free here. They had jobs, families, traditions, and a place in society. But whispers of what was happening in Germany began to fill Amsterdam's cafes and markets. Stories of businesses closing, synagogues being vandalized, and neighbors suddenly disappearing in the night trickled in, each tale like a drop of ink spreading through clear water. Amidst this shifting atmosphere was Betje, an 18-year-old from Rotterdam who'd recently moved to the capital. Betje was an ordinary young woman in many respects, but she had something that made her stand out, an energy, a liveliness that others couldn't help but notice. Her friends adored her quick wit, and her laugh could lift the spirits of even the darkest rooms. But there was something else, a fierce intelligence and a keen sense of justice that belied her youth. Betje had grown up in a mixed household with a Jewish mother and a half-Jewish father. Though her family was part of the broader community, she'd always known her heritage set her apart. Until now, it hadn't really mattered. She had friends from all backgrounds and spent her days working at a local shoe store. But 1938 marked the beginning of a journey Betje had never asked for, a journey that would soon test her character, her courage, and her loyalty. One evening after her shift at the Bata shoe store, Betje returned home to find her mother, normally cheerful and talkative, seated at the kitchen table with a look that sent a chill through her. Her father sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. "There's something we need to talk about, Betje," he said, his voice low, laced with worry. They explained the stories filtering in from friends and relatives in Germany. Friends who had been forced from their homes, families who could no longer run their businesses, and schools that had suddenly barred Jewish children from attending. It was as if an invisible wall was rising, separating Jews from the world around them. Betje felt a surge of fear and anger. Her parents' world was one that she'd always believed was safe, anchored by tradition and community. The thought that everything they'd built could be stripped away in an instant was unthinkable. "But we're in the Netherlands," she protested, her voice trembling. "They wouldn't let that happen here. We're different." Her father looked at her with tired eyes. "That's what they thought too, Betje, but these ideas, they spread like a poison. People are turning on each other." He paused, his gaze steady. "We have to be prepared for the worst." The conversation haunted Betje. She began to notice things she'd previously overlooked, the way people shifted uncomfortably when the topic of politics arose, the glances they exchanged, as if merely speaking about Germany's actions could somehow invite danger. Neighbors who had once shared warm conversations began to avoid eye contact with her family, small gestures that cut deeper than words. And there, nestled in the pit of her stomach, was a sense of helplessness. She was just one person, young, untrained, and unsure of what was coming. But even as uncertainty clouded her life, Betje's spirit refused to dim. If anything, she felt a strange kind of resolve growing within her. She realized that she was not as powerless as she'd once thought. If whispers could spread fear, then maybe her voice could spread hope. She wouldn't let the people she loved live in fear without a fight. In the following weeks, Betje began connecting with other young people who shared her concerns. They met in quiet corners of cafes, always glancing over their shoulders, always speaking in low tones. Together, they tried to piece together the puzzle of what was happening across Europe, and more importantly, what might be done if that darkness crossed into their own lives. At these meetings, Betje listened intently, absorbing every detail. Friends brought scraps of newspapers, hidden letters, and accounts of those who had already fled. Each story hit her like a blow, leaving her both frightened and furious. But the group was also a source of strength. Here, among people who shared her fear and anger, Betje found a flicker of hope. If there were others willing to resist, perhaps they could do something meaningful together. One night, after another tense meeting, Betje walked home alone, the quiet streets of Amsterdam enveloping her. She passed by the familiar buildings, each window casting a warm glow into the cool night. She couldn't shake the feeling that this might be one of the last times the city would look this way. A place she'd known all her life was changing, and though she wasn't sure how, she knew she had to be part of the answer. For the first time, she wondered if her sense of duty would lead her into danger. How far was she willing to go to protect the people she loved, the life she cherished? She imagined her mother, her father, her friends, all those innocent people who might one day be targeted, stripped of their rights, their dignity, and possibly their lives. She couldn't bear it. Returning home, Betje stood in her room, her reflection staring back from a small mirror. She looked herself in the eyes, searching for the strength she would need. "I will not let them take everything from us," she whispered, and in that quiet moment, she made a promise to herself. She would not be a bystander in the story unfolding around her. As 1938 drew to a close, Betje's life continued with its ordinary routines on the surface. But within her, a transformation was taking place. She was preparing herself, preparing to stand up, to resist, to fight back. She had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but she knew that when the time came, she would be ready. In 1940, Amsterdam fell under a shadow, transforming its once bright streets into places of fear and uncertainty. The city was no longer a refuge, but a place where every day felt like a silent struggle for survival. The Germans had invaded, and the Dutch, despite their best hopes, had been pulled into the war. What had once been whispers and distant fears was now an iron reality, felt in the silent stares of neighbors, the rattling footsteps of soldiers on cobblestone streets, and the haunting sound of sirens that sent chills through every home. For Betje WWII, now 20 years old, this transformation was both horrifying and strangely awakening. The girl who had spent her days helping her parents, working in the shoe store, and dreaming about a future suddenly found herself on an uncharted path. She was no longer just a young woman with a life of her own. She was now a witness, caught in a world where courage was demanded, not chosen. And for Betje, that meant making decisions that would haunt her long after the war ended. As the Nazis tightened their control, they imposed restrictions that fell hardest on the Jewish population. At first, it was small changes: curfews, travel restrictions, closed-off schools and cafes. But quickly, the walls closed in. Jewish families were marked and marginalized, their businesses seized, and their lives shattered. Betje watched with a sense of mounting dread as her own friends and family members became targets. One day, a family friend, Mrs. Cohen, came to Betje's home, her face pale and her hands shaking. She was in her 50s, a woman Betje had known since childhood, and her presence in their home that day changed something in Betje forever. "Betje," Mrs. Cohen whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might be listening. "They came for my brother, took him in the middle of the night. I don't know where they've taken him. I'm afraid they'll come for me next." Mrs. Cohen's voice cracked as she spoke, and Betje felt her stomach twist with anger and fear. She wrapped her arms around the woman, offering comfort, but inside, she felt a burning urge to act. She couldn't stand by and watch as innocent people were torn from their lives, from everything they knew and loved. After Mrs. Cohen left, Betje sat in her room, trying to calm the storm inside her. She knew that helping people like Mrs. Cohen would be dangerous, deadly even. The Nazis did not hesitate to punish those who resisted, and she had seen what happened to families who dared to defy them. But something had shifted within her. She could not look the other way, not when people's lives were hanging in the balance. It was around this time that Betje began to meet others who felt the same call to action. Through quiet conversations in the back rooms of cafes, hidden notes passed under doorways, and late-night meetings held in hushed tones, she found a network of people willing to risk everything. The resistance was not a singular, organized entity, but a web of ordinary people driven by extraordinary courage. Betje's first steps into this world were tentative. She started with small tasks, carrying messages, delivering packages that no one talked about, helping people find temporary hiding spots. The first time she hid a message in her shoe, her heart raced so loudly that she feared anyone could hear it. Every footstep on the street felt like it could be her last. But with each act, she grew stronger, more certain. She was learning the art of deception, the delicate dance of survival. One of Bjetje's most trusted contacts in the resistance was a man named Peter, a quiet but intense figure who seemed to know everyone and everything that happened in the city. Peter had connections to hidden safe houses, people willing to shelter Jews fleeing the Nazis, and couriers who could move across the city unnoticed. He saw something in Betje, a resilience, a fire, and took her under his wing. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Betje," he told her one night as they prepared to transport a young family to a hiding place. "It's about being terrified and still moving forward. We don't do this because it's safe. We do it because it's necessary." The family they were helping was small, a mother, father, and a boy who couldn't have been older than 6. Betje looked into the child's eyes, seeing both innocence and fear, and knew that every risk she took was worth it. Holding his tiny hand as they led him through the darkened streets, she felt the weight of his trust and the responsibility that came with it. By 1941, Amsterdam had become a city divided. The German occupation had sunk its claws deep into the daily lives of the Dutch, creating a chasm between those who obeyed, those who looked away, and those who resisted. The tension was thick, stretching across the narrow streets and quiet canals, turning neighbors into strangers, and fear into a constant companion. For Betje, who was now firmly entrenched in the resistance, the world had taken on a grim shade. Each day the rules tightened. Jewish families faced harsher restrictions, their homes marked, their freedoms erased, their existence gradually pushed to the margins. The brutality was no longer hidden in whispers. Friends disappeared overnight, businesses closed, and strangers lingered in doorways, eyes averted, unwilling to look too closely at the injustices happening in front of them. It was a city holding its breath, and Betje, who had once lived for the future, was now focused solely on surviving each day and doing whatever she could to fight back. One evening, Betje received word from Peter. The message was brief but urgent, delivered through a friend who slipped it into her coat pocket as they passed on a crowded street. When she reached a quiet spot, she unfolded the scrap of paper. The message read, "Urgent meeting tonight, 10 p.m., same place." That night, Betje arrived at a dimly lit basement in the heart of Amsterdam. The small room was filled with familiar faces, men and women who had become her second family. They were people of all ages, from all walks of life. Teachers, students, shop owners, and clerks, each one bound to the cause by the same invisible thread of courage and desperation. Peter addressed the group, his face etched with worry. "There's news from our contacts," he began, his voice steady but grave. "The Germans are planning a large-scale raid to round up Jews in our neighborhood. They're planning to clear entire blocks. We need to act fast if we're going to save anyone." A murmur of shock and fear rippled through the room, but Betje's mind was already racing. She knew people in those blocks, families who had trusted her, friends she had promised to protect. As she glanced around the room, she saw the same determination in the faces of her fellow resistors. They were scared, yes, but fear had become a part of them, something they carried alongside their courage. The plan was simple but dangerous. The group would work in pairs, going door to door, warning Jewish families about the impending raid and offering them a chance to escape. Safe houses had been prepared and routes planned, but the clock was ticking. They had less than a day to help as many people as possible. As they prepared to leave, Peter pulled Betje aside. "You know the risks," he said, his eyes searching hers. "This could be a one-way trip. If they catch you," Betje nodded, swallowing the lump of fear that had lodged in her throat. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, "but if we don't do this, who will?" The city was dark and silent as Betje moved through the streets with her partner, a young man named Henk. They approached their first house, a modest home belonging to the Silbermans, a family with 2 young children. Betje had met them several times before. Their little boy had once given her a handmade drawing, a simple gesture that now felt like a precious memory from another life. She knocked softly, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Silberman, her face weary but warm. Betje quickly explained the situation, keeping her voice low. The color drained from Mrs. Silberman's face, but she nodded, gathering her children without a word. Her husband, who had been working late in the back room, joined them, his face set in grim determination. As they led the family through back alleys and quiet streets, Betje kept a close watch on the shadows. The city felt alive with tension, every sound amplified, every movement a potential threat. They reached the first safe house without incident, and Betje felt a surge of relief. But there were many more families to warn, and time was slipping away. The hours blurred together as Betje and Henk moved from house to house, their footsteps muffled against the silent city. They encountered families in various states of readiness. Some had been waiting for this moment, already packed and prepared, while others were caught off guard. Their faces etched with panic as they scrambled to gather their children and belongings. At one house, an elderly man refused to leave, insisting that he would rather face whatever came than abandon the home where he'd spent his entire life. Betje pleaded with him, her voice thick with emotion, but he stood firm, a quiet resolve in his eyes. "Thank you for coming, dear," he said, patting her hand, "but I'm too old to run. Take care of the others." With tears in her eyes, Betje left him, carrying his parting words with her as she continued through the night. She felt the weight of every decision, every life left behind, but she pushed forward, her heart pounding with the urgency of the mission. As dawn approached, Betje and Henk reached the last address on their list, a small apartment where a young mother lived with her 2-year-old daughter. They found her in a state of panic, clutching her child as she glanced around the room, unsure of what to take and what to leave behind. Betje gently took her hands, helping her gather a few essentials. The young mother looked at her with desperate gratitude, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her daughter tightly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Betje managed a small smile, but inside, her heart was heavy. She knew that for every family they had saved, there were others they hadn't reached in time. The reality of the situation settled over her like a weight, but she knew she couldn't let it paralyze her. There would be other missions, other families to save, and she would keep fighting for as long as she had breath in her body. As she watched the sun rise over the rooftops of Amsterdam, Betje felt a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination. The night's work had taken a toll, but it had also solidified something within her, a sense of purpose that no amount of fear could shake. She was no longer just a young woman caught in the midst of a war. She was a resistor, a protector, and a symbol of hope for those who had none. By 1942, Amsterdam had become an intricate maze of secrets and dangers. The walls seemed to close in tighter every day, and the German presence was no longer just a dark cloud. It was a looming thunderstorm, striking fear into the hearts of even the bravest. The city's canals and narrow streets were now dotted with patrols, checkpoints, and armed soldiers. Each step felt like a risk, each glance like an accusation. For Betje WWII, this new year brought an even deeper commitment to the resistance. The mission that had begun as small acts of defiance, carrying messages, hiding friends, had grown into something much larger, more organized, and infinitely more dangerous. Her involvement had evolved into a full-time commitment, one that demanded her focus, her bravery, and more often than not, her silence. Every day she felt the weight of the secrets she carried. These secrets had become her constant companions, heavy and relentless, but she bore them willingly. One of Betje's most frequent tasks was the distribution of forged identity papers. The Nazis demanded that all citizens carry identification at all times, and for Jewish citizens, these papers were marked with a J, a silent yet powerful condemnation that separated them from society. In response, the resistance had begun forging new identities, creating false papers that could help Jewish families escape detection and hopefully reach safer territory. These papers were lifelines, fragile yet essential, and it was Betje's job to ensure they reached the right hands. Each week, Betje would pick up a bundle of freshly forged documents from a hidden location, often an unassuming shop or a basement tucked away in an inconspicuous neighborhood. The forgers worked tirelessly, risking everything to create these small slips of hope. The papers were precious, more valuable than gold to those whose lives depended on them, and Betje treated each one as if it were a treasure. One day, Betje received a particularly urgent request. A family, a father, mother, and their young daughter, were in immediate danger. Their names had been added to a deportation list, and they had just hours to escape before the Germans came for them. Betje felt the familiar rush of urgency, her mind racing through the logistics, the routes, the safe houses they could use. This was no ordinary delivery. It was a race against time. She set out that evening, her bag filled with the documents and a few other essentials. She walked quickly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet streets, her heart pounding with each step. Amsterdam at night was a city transformed, its usual charm turned eerie under the dim streetlights, every shadow a potential threat. When she reached the family's home, she found them waiting in the dark, their faces tense with fear. The little girl, no older than 6, clung to her mother, her wide eyes darting between Betje and the shadows outside. Betje knelt down, offering a reassuring smile as she handed the parents their new papers. "These will get you past the checkpoints," she whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Follow the route I gave you and don't look back. There's a safe house waiting for you in Utrecht. You'll be safe there." The father reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he took the papers. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We didn't know if we'd make it through the night." Betje gave a slight nod, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had seen this look many times before, the mix of fear, gratitude, and fragile hope. She had learned to hold back her own emotions, to keep her focus sharp, but each mission left an invisible scar, a reminder of the lives she touched and the dangers she couldn't always outrun. As she watched the family disappear into the night, Betje's heart ached with the knowledge that she might never see them again. She hoped they would reach safety, but she knew the odds were slim. The network was strong, but the Nazis were relentless. Every family she helped felt like a victory, but every family lost was a reminder of the cost. The work took a toll on her. She barely slept, her mind always racing, her body constantly on edge. The secrecy, the constant fear of discovery, it wore her down. But there was no room for weakness in this life. She reminded herself that every mission was a step toward freedom, a small act of defiance that chipped away at the darkness, engulfing her world. As the year dragged on, the resistance began to face even harsher crackdowns. Friends and fellow resistors were arrested, taken in the night by soldiers who left nothing but silence in their wake. Betje's heart sank each time she heard of another capture, each loss a painful blow to the network she had come to rely on. One evening, as Betje was preparing to leave for another delivery, she received devastating news. Her friend and mentor, Peter, the man who had introduced her to the resistance, had been arrested. The Gestapo had raided his hideout, seizing him and his contacts. Betje's blood ran cold as she imagined him alone in a cell, facing interrogations that no one survived unbroken. The news shook her deeply, leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable. Peter had been a pillar of strength for her, a guiding force in the dark. His absence left a void she could not fill, and for the first time, doubt began to creep in. Could she continue without him? Could she carry on, knowing that the same fate might await her at any moment? But then she remembered the families, the Silbermans, the young mother and her daughter, the countless others she had helped. She thought of their faces, their words of gratitude, and she knew she couldn't abandon them. Peter had taught her that the fight was bigger than any one person, that their work was not about personal survival, but about the survival of something greater. Hope, humanity, and the belief that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. Betje took a deep breath, steeling herself. She would continue, not only for herself but for Peter, for the families still waiting in the shadows, for everyone who needed someone to believe in them. As she stepped into the cold night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had no illusions about the dangers she faced, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight, she would resist, and she would not stop until every last family was safe, or until she herself could fight no more. By 1943, the German grip on Amsterdam was suffocating. The charm and life that once filled the city were replaced by fear, silence, and an ever-present watchfulness. The once familiar streets had become battlegrounds, not in the traditional sense, but in the quiet resistance that ordinary people like Betje carried out in the shadows. Every day was a gamble, and every person she passed on the street could be a friend or a spy. Betje had now become one of the most trusted couriers in the resistance. She was known for her unwavering dedication, her quick thinking, and her ability to disappear into a crowd without a trace. Her work had shifted from simply transporting forged documents to coordinating movements, overseeing safe houses, and organizing escapes for Jewish families and resistance fighters alike. It was dangerous work, and as the Nazis tightened their control, Betje felt the walls closing in. One evening, Betje was called to a meeting in a safe house on the outskirts of Amsterdam. It was a small, inconspicuous home, hidden behind rows of narrow buildings. She arrived at dusk, slipping through the door with her usual caution, her senses heightened as she scanned the room. Gathered inside were fellow members of the resistance. Some she knew well, others were new faces, each bearing the familiar look of determination laced with exhaustion. As they settled in, Peter's replacement, a woman named Anna, addressed the group. She was a sharp, composed figure with a calm authority that reminded Betje of Peter. Anna's eyes swept over the room, her voice low but clear. "We've received word of a high-value prisoner transport scheduled for tomorrow night," she began. "They're moving dozens of people to a concentration camp, including several of our contacts who were arrested last week. We believe we have a chance to intercept the transport and free them, but it's going to be dangerous." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Everyone understood the risks. The Nazis did not take acts of defiance lightly. Anyone caught in an escape attempt would face immediate execution or worse. But there was no hesitation among them. Each person knew the stakes, and each had already made the decision to sacrifice whatever was necessary. Betje felt her heart quicken as Anna continued outlining the plan. The operation would require several couriers to divert guards, distract the patrols, and guide the prisoners to safety. Betje's role was pivotal. She would be responsible for creating a diversion that would allow Anna and the others to intercept the transport without raising alarms. The night before the operation, Betje returned home to prepare. She gathered her supplies, maps, coded messages, forged documents, and packed them carefully, her hands steady despite the tension coursing through her. She knew that this mission was one of the most dangerous she had ever undertaken, but she had long since accepted that fear was part of the work. She had learned to carry it with her, like a shadow, acknowledging it but never letting it rule her actions. The following evening, Betje took her position near a narrow alley that led to the transport route. The air was cold, biting against her skin as she waited in the shadows, her senses alert. She glanced at her watch, timing herself precisely. The plan hinged on perfect timing. One misstep, one delay, and the entire operation would collapse. At exactly the right moment, Betje stepped into the street, her heart pounding as she approached the checkpoint. She held her forged identification papers, prepared to act as if she were lost and in need of assistance. The soldiers eyed her with suspicion, and Betje felt a wave of anxiety as one of them took her papers and scrutinized them closely. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. Betje forced a smile, her voice steady, but with a hint of nervousness that she hoped would seem genuine. "I was visiting my aunt. She's unwell and needed help with the housework. I must have lost track of the time." The soldier studied her, his gaze hard. For a moment, Betje feared he would see through her act. But just then, another soldier called out, distracted by a noise further down the street. The first phase of their diversion plan. Betje felt a rush of relief as the soldier returned her papers and waved her off, dismissing her as just another harmless civilian. With the soldiers momentarily distracted, Betje slipped away, moving quickly through the shadows to signal to Anna and the others. She watched from a distance as the resistance fighters emerged from hidden positions, swiftly and silently moving toward the transport truck. The guards were preoccupied, their attention diverted by Betje's maneuver, and for a few precious minutes, the resistance had the upper hand. Betje's heart raced as she watched the operation unfold. She knew that at any moment, the soldiers could realize what was happening, and the entire plan could fall apart. But the resistance fighters moved with practiced precision, unlocking the truck's doors and guiding the prisoners out, one by one. Their faces pale and weary, but filled with a glimmer of hope. Among the prisoners was a man Betje recognized, an old friend of her father's, someone she hadn't seen since childhood. Their eyes met for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition passing between them before he was ushered away. It was a silent reminder of the cost of the war, of the lives shattered and families torn apart. But tonight, they had won a small victory, and that was enough to keep going. As the last of the prisoners disappeared into the night, the resistance fighters melted back into the shadows. Betje lingered only long enough to ensure everyone had escaped before making her own way home, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. She knew that tonight's success was only a brief reprieve, that the fight was far from over, but it was moments like these, fleeting as they were, that reminded her of why she had chosen this path. In the days that followed, the Nazis launched an intense search for those responsible for the escape. The city was alive with tension, checkpoints increased, and soldiers patrolled the streets with a ruthless vigilance. Betje kept her head down, moving cautiously, her instincts on high alert. Each time she passed a soldier, each time she entered a crowded street, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. But even as the walls closed in tighter, Betje's resolve only grew stronger. She had seen the power of hope, the strength of those willing to risk everything for others. She had seen families reunited, lives saved, and dreams rekindled. And she knew that as long as there were people willing to fight, there was still a chance for freedom. In 1944, the world seemed to be holding its breath. The Allied forces were making progress, inching closer with each battle, and whispers of liberation began to circulate. But in Amsterdam, the occupation had only tightened its stranglehold on the city, leaving its people with little hope and fewer choices. The German forces, sensing the tides beginning to shift, doubled down in their hunt for resistance fighters. For Betje WWII, it was a year filled with both desperate anticipation and profound dread. The stakes had never been higher, and the cost of every choice felt like a crushing weight. By now, Betje was deeply embedded in the resistance. She had survived raids, arrests, and close calls that left her shaken but determined. Her face had grown lean, her eyes sharp with the kind of vigilance only those who lived in constant danger could understand. Her movements were careful, her plans meticulous. Every task felt like a life-or-death mission, and in many ways, it was. One day in early spring, Betje was summoned to a clandestine meeting in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension as she entered the dimly lit space. Around her were faces she recognized, old friends, new allies, people she had come to trust with her life. They gathered in silence, waiting as Anna, their leader, prepared to speak. "This year may be our last chance," Anna began, her voice low but resolute. "The Allies are advancing, but until they reach us, we're alone. The Nazis know this, and they're tightening their grip on every resistance cell. They're cracking down harder than ever. We have to be more vigilant, more careful, but we also have to be prepared to make sacrifices." The room fell into a heavy silence. Everyone understood what sacrifices meant. They had all seen friends, comrades, even family members disappear, arrested, or worse. The Gestapo was ruthless, and betrayal was a constant fear. Trust was a rare commodity, and even among their ranks, suspicion lingered. Betje felt the weight of Anna's words settle over her. The previous year had been brutal, but she sensed that 1944 would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had become her family. In each face, she saw the same determination, the same willingness to risk everything. And in that moment, she knew she would do whatever it took to see this through to the end. The resistance had grown bolder in their missions, targeting German supply lines, sabotaging transportation routes, and gathering intelligence that they smuggled to the Allies. Each mission was a calculated risk, but Betje had learned to move like a shadow, disappearing into crowds, slipping through checkpoints with forged papers, her heart steady despite the ever-present fear of discovery. One evening, Betje received an urgent message. A fellow resistance fighter, a man named Theo, had been captured. Theo was a vital part of their network, someone who knew names, locations, and plans. The Gestapo had taken him to a notorious holding facility in Amsterdam, where prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and often executed. The resistance knew that if Theo broke under questioning, the entire network would be exposed. Lives would be lost, safe houses compromised, families torn apart. They had no choice but to attempt a rescue, a plan so dangerous it bordered on impossible. But desperation had become their fuel, and failure was not an option. Betje volunteered immediately. Theo had been her friend, a confidant who had shared in her fears, her victories, her losses. She couldn't abandon him to that fate, and she was willing to risk her life to bring him back. The plan was hastily arranged. Betje and a small team would create a distraction, drawing the guards' attention long enough for others to reach Theo and slip him out before the alarm could be raised. Every detail was meticulously planned, but they all knew that once inside, anything could go wrong. The night of the mission, Betje's hands trembled as she prepared. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, reminding herself of why she was there. She wasn't just fighting for Theo, or even for her friends in the resistance. She was fighting for every family that had been torn apart, every innocent person who had lost everything. This was her purpose, her duty. They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping through alleys and side streets until they reached the holding facility. The building loomed in front of them, a symbol of terror and oppression. Betje felt a chill run down her spine as she approached, but she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the plan, the rhythm of her steps, the beat of her heart. As the distraction unfolded, Betje slipped past the guards, her movements quick and silent. She reached the holding area, where she found Theo locked in a small dark cell, his face pale and bruised, but his eyes bright with hope when he saw her. "Betje," he whispered, his voice cracked but filled with relief. "I didn't think anyone would come." She gave him a quick nod, her eyes scanning the corridor. "We're not leaving you behind," she replied, her voice firm. "Can you walk?" He nodded, struggling to his feet. Together they moved quickly, guided by the shadows, Betje's heart racing with every step. The sounds of the distraction echoed through the building, giving them precious moments to slip away undetected. But as they neared the exit, a guard spotted them. Betje's blood ran cold as he shouted, raising his weapon. Without thinking, she shoved Theo forward, urging him to run as she turned to face the guard. In that moment, she knew she might not survive, but she was willing to give Theo the chance to escape, to keep their mission alive. Just as the guard raised his weapon, another resistance fighter emerged from the shadows, tackling him to the ground. Betje took the opportunity, grabbing Theo's arm and dragging him toward the exit. Together they burst into the night, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they sprinted through the streets, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They ran until their lungs burned, until they reached the edge of the city, where a safe house awaited them. As they stumbled inside, Betje collapsed onto the floor, her heart pounding, her body exhausted but alive. Theo looked at her, gratitude and relief etched into his battered face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Betje managed a weak smile, but inside she felt the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. She knew that this victory, like all the others, was fleeting. The war was far from over, and each day brought new challenges, new losses, new sacrifices. As she lay there, catching her breath, Betje thought of all those who were still out there, waiting for liberation, waiting for hope. And she knew that, no matter how exhausted she was, she would continue to fight. She would carry on for Theo, for her friends, for the city she loved, and for the countless others who depended on the resistance to survive. By early 1945, Amsterdam was a city drained of its former life, its people worn down by years of occupation, fear, and hardship. But there was a new feeling in the air, a cautious hope that perhaps, finally, the end was near. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of Allied forces moving closer, of liberation just on the horizon. For Betje Very, who had given everything to the resistance, this was the moment she had been fighting for, the light she had clung to through the darkest nights. One evening in April, Betje was called to a final meeting with her fellow fighters. She looked around the room at the familiar faces, some scarred, others weary, but all filled with a quiet resilience. Anna, their leader, stood at the front, her expression softer than Betje had ever seen. "The Allies are close," she said, her voice barely containing the emotion that filled the room. "It's only a matter of days now." The room filled with murmurs of relief and cautious joy. Betje felt a wave of emotion wash over her, memories of every mission, every sacrifice, every friend she had lost coming to the surface. She had fought, risked her life, and seen the unthinkable, but it had all been for this, the promise of freedom. In the following days, Betje watched as the German soldiers began to retreat, their once rigid grip on the city loosening. And on May 5, 1945, the impossible happened. The Netherlands was liberated. Betje stood in the streets among her fellow Amsterdammers, people cheering, crying, embracing each other. She felt an overwhelming mixture of joy and grief, relief and sorrow. The city was free, but it would never be the same. The people she had fought alongside, the friends she had lost, and the sacrifices she had made were forever etched in her heart. As she looked around, Betje felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fight was over, but her memories and the legacy of resistance would live on. She had survived, not just for herself, but for everyone who couldn't. And now, with the dawn of peace, she could finally lay down her burdens, knowing that the city she loved was free once more.